Okay. So in this video, what we're going to do is continue on to our Power Automate segment, really just talking about Power Automate and how a professional developer or a developer who's familiar with the Microsoft ecosystem, probably more so on the .NET side, but also on the full stack side, but just really understand and tailor to some of these technical concepts in a way that you can leverage the Power Automate tool to kind of develop and create either batch processes, advanced workflows, and maybe some integration points and so on and so forth. So let's jump right in. So if I go down to our Power Automate subsection here, we talked about workflows more so for power users. Now let's talk about pro dev. So what I really want to touch on, let's look at the workflow pieces of it, right? So as a professional developer, there's going to be two sides of the workflows, right? So one, you're just going to do workflows very similar to a power user, but you're going to create these workflows to kind of make your life in the IT department or the technology department that much easier. So for example, if you're part of a SharePoint team and you're part of the SharePoint administration team and you want your end users to request a site or request a Microsoft Teams site, and you don't want to enable the out-of-the-box self-service for very many reasons why sometimes self-service is not a good thing, even though that's on by default, and that's what Microsoft pushes. From an organization perspective, we probably want these sites, more than likely you want these sites to be, one, accounted for. You want to pepper in some governance and things along those lines. So what you can do is leverage both the Power Apps and Power Automate to something similar to this. So this is one, a site request form, just kind of give you some idea. And my end users, what they would do is come in and just say the Deshaun Playground site, and they're going to be part of the technology. And here I'm giving them the site types, but notice what I'm doing here, right? You don't see them requesting a Microsoft Teams site. You don't see them requesting a SharePoint communication site or a SharePoint Teams site, because here they understand the business activity or the business intent, but not necessarily the technology. So you take the technology out, and that sets you up for a lot of things. One, it doesn't confuse the user. Sometimes a user don't even know they need a Microsoft Team versus a SharePoint site versus a Yammer site versus a XYZ. So you remove that piece of the confusion out of the process and really going to focus on the business activity. The other thing that you do with this site type is you allow the organization to morph this into and embracing the latest technology, right? So even like the Microsoft Viva suite that's coming out, right? So this could be a Viva in Connection site, or maybe it could be a Viva Engage site that represents, maybe one of these community sites. So maybe in Q1 of 2000, a community site could have been a Yammer site, but now Q1 in 2023, a community site could be a Viva Engage site, right? And you can pivot and make that switch on the back end without having to do this full training and communication to the org that says, oh, if you want, we got this new technology, this new site called the Viva Engage, and this is how it compares to Yammer, or this is how it compares out. So you take all that confusion out of it. So allow them to select the site. And I want them to specify how many users are going to be using the site. Data classifications, again, this is a governance piece that you can layer into your workflow that, either a pro dev or even the governance team or a collaboration of the two are trying to determine, okay, every time a user or a colleague requests a site, we need to know the type of information that, they're going to be storing there. So if it's confidential, then we need to layer into this, these types of record retention schedule or this type of sensitivity labels and da-da-da-da. And then you want primary owners. And here's another governance piece, right, that you can enforce right here at the very beginning stages of this request process. You probably want to, it's probably a really good idea to make sure that every site that gets provisioned, or a Microsoft Teams site or Viva Connection site, Engage site, whatever, every site that gets created, you have at least two business owners or two people responsible for that site in the event someone leaves the organization or is on vacation, because you really want the owners, right, the RACI, right, the roles and responsibilities of a site owner, and you want to ensure that there's at least two owners. So once they click submit here, if I go back to the whiteboard, what ends up happening is that we have that Power App collecting all of this data And basically what that's going to do is very similar to what we covered in the video yesterday. They're going to drop that information into a SharePoint list. From that SharePoint list, I would then trigger a Power Automate. Now this Power Automate is going to be a bit more sophisticated than what my power users will create, or my average app maker will create, because what this thing is going to do is going to trigger this Power Automate. The Power Automate would then take that information from that site request form, and then it would trigger an Azure function, right? And then with that Azure function, you have to pass it key information. So based on that site type that was created, there's site templates that's stored in XML in the document library that's already pre-provisioned, right? So if they select communication site, okay, that's going to be a Yammer site, and we're going to take the SharePoint piece of that, and then we package that all up into XML. And that's probably a little bit more complex. This scenario don't do that. But imagine if you can do that, right? Because now in Power Automate, the thing I'm trying to get to is you can execute a script using a Azure function, right? And that can be PowerShell, or it could be, .NET Core, code inside it, wrapped inside that Azure function, whatever the case may be. But it would then have the instructions on how to execute or provision that site based on the site selection that was created. And then once that provisioning happens, right, you will do a call and wait, and you'll wait for a response. And sometimes these are fire and forget. So what you probably would do is fire this Azure function in this example, right, and then have the Azure function execute the line of code that's encapsulated in that function, and the last line of that code, once it goes to the provisioning and all this other good stuff, is then you write back to a SharePoint list, right? Again, because this is a fire and forget. So once it fires, it's not going to wait. And I think we ran into technical issues having it wait for a response back from the function. So you fire and forget, and then at the end of the function, it writes to a SharePoint list. Let's just call this, provisioned site. It writes that to a SharePoint list, and then that would in turn have another Power Automate, and this is going to be really straightforward, that gets triggered when the item is created. And basically all this is going to do is send a confirmation email to those site owners that was specified. So you had a primary site owner, a secondary site owner. The primary would get a notification and probably CC the secondary. It has to link to the site that was provisioned or a Microsoft team. And then, maybe it's a link to the governance document that says, okay, you're a site owner. These are the roles and responsibilities. This is the expectations that we have. These are our governance policies. So you will send that. That will probably be embedded in the document. And then also, I'm a really, really, really big fan of this, is that you send them a link to maybe a Yammer site or some other site to where they can get resources and get connected with other site owners within the organization, right? Because I love that peer-to-peer environment with administrator oversight, right? Note the difference. It's a peer-to-peer environment, because you don't want your administrators and architects and governance champions to have to answer each and every question. That becomes their job, right? But you have a lot of evangelists and power users and people within the org who just get it. They may not be part of IT, they may not be part of your governance team, but they just get the technology. They really embrace this. They went through training. They're watching all these YouTube videos. They got a ton of tips and tricks on how they do things. You may even have a UI UX person part of that community, so that way they can answer questions on, is this page too busy? Am I using my colors right? Or, maybe I'm creating this Power App forum, which is a different group. Give me some tips and tricks to make this more user friendly. I have a better user experience, But you give them that site, that Yammer group, to where they have a Yammer feed. They can ask questions. They can, get feedback from other colleagues, so on and so forth. So I say all that to say, from a pro dev, this whole piece right here, where you have that Azure function and making those calls, are capabilities that you can do within side of a Power Automate workflow. Not only is this Azure function is a great pro dev tool, but also calling the REST API. Here's another thing that you can do. Like, there is no action under the SharePoint connector in Power Automate that allow you to create a site, or that allow you to create a sub-site within the existing site collection. Understanding that sub-sites are fading, right? You want things flat, But you would notice that there's not one, okay, here's more that's more relevant. There's not one that allow you to create a modern news article, right? So because of those misses or those gaps that are available to you with actions and connectors explicitly, we know as pro developers, those capabilities exist, but they may be tucked away under an API. And that's the other one, right? So within Power Automate, you can call a SharePoint API, and really this is supposed to be the gap filler for those things that are not readily available as actions for the predefined connectors. Not saying that, you know, creating news articles or creating subsites or even creating site collections won't be available in the future, but sometimes, you know, you need that capability and it's not available for right now. So, you know, how do we supplement that? And these APIs are really the catch-all, if you would, right? So here, let me show you an example of this. I have an RSS feed that's looking at a public-facing website, a public-facing WordPress site, and it's subscribed to that feed, and it uses the created date to determine if, you know, and probably pose it. I don't know what happens behind the scene for this particular action, but it probably posts that RSS and say, okay, give me, you know, show me the last created date for the last post in this feed. I don't have that one. Okay, that's one that I'm missing. So it grabs the preliminary data. It grabs a thumbnail. I don't know why it does this. I forget why we had to embed this inside of there. But you can see grabbing the thumbnail or making a call for a thumbnail. This is an API call that's built in. It takes and creates the JSON. And then the last step, and as you can see, this is probably 5 or 6 actions that's needed, but it's peppered in. These are pro dev, what I would consider pro dev elements or characteristics of this workflow, where it creates the JSON payload. And then in this last action here, it calls, again, another API call to repost, which is going to give us the ability to create a modern news article based on that RSS feed. So the business requirement or the business scenario for this is that we have our public facing site. Marketing is always updating the public on what we're doing or some of the key initiatives, key findings, whatever the case may be. Instead of having marketing double enter that information, this job would just scrape those news articles based on that post and then recreate those as modern news articles within SharePoint for the intranet, right? And then you have all the, you know, information or security that's needed to make that happen. And let's talk about security real quick, especially in this context. We're going to go do a deep dive into security, but you would notice that maybe this Clardo account and this M365 service account may not have write access to that SharePoint site. Here, I can elevate that access and run it in the context of this Arvind account that will have full control or write access to that. So that way I don't have to give every user in the organization access to a site that I'm creating information dynamically. I probably just want to give them read access. But this is another prime example to where you can have multiple accounts, right, created where some certain accounts have privilege, elevated access compared to other accounts, and you can secure those in a way. And we'll talk through what is some of the different patterns. I'm going to say best practice, because I think the best practice is in the context of the organization. But in another video, when we talk about security, elevating privileges, and maximizing a cost-effective pattern on using premium connectors, because sometimes you just can't avoid premium connectors, but there's a way that you can design and create Power Automates in a way to where the cost is minimal, so you can do it in a cost-effective fashion. But we will talk through how do you manage service accounts, right? Manage service accounts in the sense that every app maker doesn't know the credentials of the service account from an information security perspective. Cybersecurity perspective is a big no-no, right? You don't want to have 4 or 5 service accounts and every app maker knowing the username and password. Well, the password, they need to know the username, but the password of that, and what does that process look like behind the scenes, okay? So those are kind of give you some really high level ideas on workflow. So here's another one that I would like to cover in this video. Let's talk about complex approval processes, right? So we know in Power Automate, if you use Power Automate, power users and app makers are familiar with the approval action or the approval connector that's baked in within Power Automate. And it's really convenient, right? Because, you can get those notifications if you're an approver and your approval or decision is needed in a certain portion of the workflow. You get notification in Outlook. There's a nice embedded, I think, action card, or I forget the name of it. It's like a custom action. There's a name for it. I forget the name of it, but if you know the name, please leave it in the chat. But there's like a custom action is really HTML that's embedded in Outlook, or really just HTML that kind of right by itself, that it doesn't have any references to libraries and stuff like that. So it's an all-encompassing snippets of HTML. You can have functionality, a nice UI, But anyway, you have those embedded within Outlook, and as an approver, I can approve or decline that particular request. I also get that notification when using the approval action within Power Automate in Power Automate, as well as in Microsoft Teams, right? So there's an ecosystem centered around that approval piece. But the approval piece is, you can quickly outgrow its capabilities. So what we tend to find is that as a pro developer, or even as an architect, you come up with these designs and these solution patterns to allow you to do more robust approval actions. And what does that look like? So a robust approval action may look like something like this, right? So here I'm gonna have my form, and then my user will fill this form out and then click submit. In this form, they select a particular, let's just say category to keep it simple, and they may belong to a particular location, right? So based on the category and the location of this, abstract request, it's going to submit that data and write it to a SharePoint list. The complexity of this really starts to come into these categories. One, there's 50 of them. In these locations, there are, let's say, 10 of those. So you have 10 locations and 50 different categories to select from. And based on each category, there's a certain approval that's needed. And based on the category and location combination, it could be a 2 or 3 or 4 level stage of approvals that are needed, right? So say, for example, I'm gonna make this up. The category I select is travel, and then the location I'm gonna select is Ghana, right? So when I'm traveling to Ghana, a couple of things need to happen. For travel in Ghana, I need approval from my immediate manager. I also need approval from my division director, and I also need approval from the site manager in Ghana, right? And this approval action only happens if and only if I select travel and I select Ghana, right? And then you can escalate this. You can add more to this, right? It could be, okay, what's your role in the organization? Are you a manager? If you're a manager, maybe you don't need a manager. You can skip that set. You need a division director and a site manager, So because I have 50 of these categories and I have 10 optional locations, the biggest question is going to be, what is the best approach, right? And this is where your solution architect hat comes on. What is the best approach to, one, encapsulate all of this logic, or account for all of this logic? Two, account for these different categories and locations and map them to the individuals that are needed for those approvals without hard coding that inside of the Power Automate. From what I've seen and others that I talk to that kind of solve this problem, the first thing that should pop out into your head is to keep these into a SharePoint list, right? So now I have a SharePoint list that may have all of my locations, and within that location, I'm gonna have the approvals, right? And there's many different ways how you can design this, right? You can have a location entry, and then the approvals going across, where you say approver 1, the column, one column approval 1, another column is approver 2, another column approver 3, Or you can build it vertically to where you have an entry and then approval, right? So then you can have, I have my category 1 approver, and then I can say stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. Another category approver, stage 2. Same category approver, stage 3. So you can kind of build it horizontally, or you can build it vertically, or you can build it horizontally. And a lot of this really depends on how do you need to scale, right? So if your approvers are finite, that says at most I'm only going to have 4, so I only need to scale to 4, then create your generic columns that way. Or if you need flexibility that, okay, I have 4 today, but I could have 5 or 6 in the future, then I may want to build it in that vertical fashion. But in the end, that's how you do it. And that's where, your skill set, this is where you're wrapping your solution architect skills and, technical aptitude along with, how you design this thing. And then once you get into Power Automate, now you have to be able to do these lookups in a most efficient manner and effective manner, and then variables and things along those lines. So as you can see, a requirement that on paper is medium complex. This is not overly complex, right? The fact that you have many different categories, and then for those categories you have locations, and then maybe you have a combination of 2 that determine your routing or the approvals that are needed. That's probably a medium complex requirement. But the question is, how do you implement that in a way that 1 is scalable, 2, you can make changes to, especially the things that may change often. Like, okay, for Ghana, I got this new approver now, like, Jim is no longer here, or Jim moved to a different area of the organization. And now here's, Bob or whoever is going to take their place. Your business users or the business admin, not necessarily IT admin, right? Again, we want to delegate this stuff off to where IT is not a bottleneck for simple changes. Your business admin, who's going to be administrator of the solution, should be able to go into this configuration list, update that person, and that should work without any coding changes to your workflow. That's where the pro developer skill set comes in. That's where the solution architect skill set comes in. And again, this is all Power Automate. It's all workflows, but this is really built to say, I have an area for very simple solutions that are great for Power Apps and Power users or app makers. I got more complex scenarios to where you need a solution architect. You need to look at these solutions with your solution architect lens on, as well as have the technical aptitude that when it comes to implementing that, you have enough skill set and comfortability with APIs and creating JSON payloads and processing JSON result sets and loop and building your loops in a more efficient manner to where things work and progress in an efficient way, and you're not making a lot of API calls and running up your API counts for that hour, right? All of that is pro dev scenarios. Now I say pro dev scenarios, but I can easily take an app maker who understands or get trained up on JSON and start to understand and appreciate the patterns of processing JSON and creating efficient loops to where you're processing as much as possible with minimum API calls, trying to stay within that hourly threshold, and they can be very efficient at this as well. All right, so that's a taste of what we have for workflows. In the next video, what are we covering? In the next video, we will cover batch jobs and the different scenarios for batch jobs. All right, any questions, go ahead and leave it in the comments section. What other scenarios have you faced as a pro developer or as an app maker, and you need a pro developer to come in and kind of help take the ball across the goal line to get things done? I'm very interested in your experience with Power Automate. I'll see you tomorrow.